Hello, dear all. It's my great pleasure to open the seminar on issues of nationalism and nationalizing states, and to introduce you with our guest, Professor Rodžera Brubeikera from University of California, whose main theme of research is about actually diversity and different aspects of processes of nationalism. And it happened that also post-Soviet territories came into his point of view. And today we will have not only lecture, but also two co-referees on these issues. Actually, so to say, probably it will be native scientific point of view, I would say. And then after end we will have discussions and place for questions and discussions. And I would like to also thank European Commission Erasmus Mundus programs for supporting this issue, and also Faculty of Social Sciences for supporting this event in very practical terms. And now I would like to give floor to Professor for lecture or speech about Nationalizing States Revisited, Projects and Processes of Nationalization in Post-Soviet States. Yeah, floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and especially to have the opportunity to discuss my work with Latvian colleagues. My lecture today allows me to revisit the notion of the nationalizing state that I developed in earlier work on Central and East European nationalism. I want to ask whether the notion of the nationalizing state can serve as a useful conceptual prism or conceptual framework for the comparative analysis of processes of nation and state building in the post-Soviet space. So does this framework help us pose fruitful comparative questions? Does it suggest potentially fruitful lines of analysis? These are the questions that I want to ask. I'll begin by sketching the conceptual model of the nationalizing state, by noting the pervasiveness of nationalizing discourse in Soviet successor states, and by suggesting how two aspects of the Soviet legacy help account for the pervasiveness of this discourse. And I'll then go on to broaden the discussion to include not just nationalizing discourse, but nationalizing policies, practices, and processes. And I'll do this by focusing on a series of key domains and drawing my examples from Estonia, Latvia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. And I'll conclude by considering some limitations of the model of nationalizing states. So let me begin with the conceptual model. In earlier work that focused empirically on interwar Poland, I identified 7 elements characteristic of state building and nationalist politics in the successor states to the Habsburg, Romanov, and Ottoman empires. The first is the idea that the state contains a core nation or nationality, a core nation that's understood in ethno-cultural terms and that's distinguished from the citizenry or the permanent resident population of the state as a whole. The second is an idea of ownership or primacy. That is, the state is understood as the state of and for that particular core nation. The third element is the idea that the core nation is in a weak or unhealthy condition. And the fourth element then is the idea that specific action is needed to strengthen the core nation, to promote its language, its cultural flourishing, its demographic robustness, its economic welfare, or its political hegemony. The fifth element is the idea that this kind of strengthening action is remedial or compensatory. That is, it's needed to redress previous discrimination or oppression suffered by the core nation. The sixth element is mobilization on the basis of this set of ideas in electoral campaigns or the press or the street or other settings. And the final element is the adoption of formal and informal policies and practices that are informed and justified by these ideas. Now, some 15 years later, I'm inclined to distinguish the first 5 elements I just listed from the last 2. The first 5 define the contours of a distinctive discourse, that is, a distinctive way of thinking and talking about nation and state, whereas the last 2 elements point to mobilizations, policies, and practices informed by this discourse. But today, what strikes me is that there's something missing from this set of 7 elements, and that is any reference to nationalizing processes or outcomes. The model, and I'm using that word very loosely, the model did not refer to the social processes as distinguished from the state policies or practices or discourses through which language repertoires or ethnodemographic patterns or structures of economic and political dominance actually change, or through which ethno-national boundaries are sharpened or blurred. And this was a significant omission. It was an omission because the relation between nationalizing policies and practices on the one hand and nationalizing processes or outcomes on the other hand is complex and ambiguous. So nationalizing discourses and nationalizing processes do not necessarily produce nationalizing outcomes, and conversely, nationalizing processes may occur even in the absence of expressly nationalizing discourse or policies. Now, I'm going to begin today with some observations about nationalizing discourse, and then I'll broaden the discussion to consider the interplay of nationalizing discourse, but also policies and social processes. So the key elements of nationalizing discourse, just to recap them briefly, involve a distinction between core nation and total population, a claim to ownership or primacy, a diagnosis of weakness of the core nation, a call for remedial action, and a justification in terms of compensation or redress for earlier harm. These discursive motifs are very familiar throughout post-Soviet space. They're important elements of what you could call political common sense in almost all of the successor states. And of course, they're found in many other contexts as well, not just in the post-Soviet space. 2 aspects of the Soviet legacy help account for the common sense nature of nationalizing discourse. One is the distinctive Soviet system of institutionalized multinationality, and the other is the manner in which centralized rule and statewide economic integration led to linguistic and demographic Russification. Of course, you're very familiar with both of these, so I'll just be very quick in sketching what I mean by this. The Soviet system of institutionalized multinationality can be understood as a gigantic and historically unprecedented exercise in the creation and institutionalization of internal ethno-national boundaries. So you have the more than 50 putatively more or less autonomous national homelands created in the familiar 4-tiered hierarchy, each defined and identified as the territory of and for a particular ethno-national group. And of course, even the Union republics were autonomous in name only, but the formal trappings of nation statehood mattered. They mattered because they institutionalized and reified territorial boundaries. They mattered because they fostered and legitimated certain ways of thinking, certain expectations, and most crucially, they fostered and legitimated a sense of ethno-national ownership of bounded national territories. Paralleling the division of territory into bounded national units, of course, was the division of the population into bounded ethno-national collectivities. Every citizen was assigned an official ethnocultural nationality, ascribed at birth on the basis of descent, registered in identity documents, recorded in bureaucratic encounters, and used to control access to things like higher education and employment. And I think the key point is that this system of personal nationality had no territorial dimension, being entirely independent of place of residence. So this dual scheme of institutionalized multinationality defined both territories and collectivities in ethno-national terms, but there was an asymmetry between the two. That is, the national territories presupposed the prior existence of ethnocultural nations the national territorial republics, that is, did not constitute or define the nations for whom they were created, as in the so-called civic or territorial model of nationhood. Rather, independently existing nations were given their own territorial polities. So the nationalities, as it were, possessed their respective territorial polities rather than being constituted by them. The construction of national territories as the polities of and for independently existing ethnocultural nations fostered the habit of distinguishing between the core state-bearing nation or titular nation and the total population of the republic in Soviet times, and it also fostered the sense of titular ownership of or primacy within each republic. So these dispositions translated official ethno-national boundaries into cultural idioms and repertoires of claims-making that remain discursively robust in the successor states. Now, the Soviet regime constituted both ethnocultural nations and endowed them with their own theoretically autonomous, even sovereign territorial polities, but of course it did not grant them substantive powers of self-rule, and even apart from the massive repression directed against some ethno-national communities at certain junctures, large-scale migration and gradual linguistic Russification, again, very familiar, of course, to you, threatened to undermine the cultural and demographic bases of a number of the national polities. And this is the second aspect of the Soviet legacy I want to highlight. How could Kazakhstan be the republic of and for Kazakhs, or Latvia the republic of and for Latvians, if titulars comprised, as they did in 1989, just 43% of the population in Kazakhstan and a bare majority in Latvia? How could education be considered national, even in form, when the medium of secondary and higher education had shifted increasingly to Russian, and when significant fractions of titular nationality in some republics, notably in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, no longer spoke what was supposed to be their own language? So political centralization, economic integration, population mixing, and linguistic Russification could be seen, and were seen, as undercutting the model of institutionalized multinationality by eroding and blurring ethno-national boundaries and leading to denationalization, or even in some of the rhetoric as threatening national extinction. And indeed, by the 1960s, official Soviet doctrine envisioned not only the drawing together or zbliženia of nationalities, but their eventual fusion or slianya. And this aspect then of the Soviet legacy helps account for the pervasiveness of the discourse of titular weakness, remedial action, and ethnic redress in the post-Soviet era. So nationalizing discourse then is pervasive in the successor states, but of course it doesn't have the own field to itself. It's not the only discourse out there. It's intertwined often with other discourses, including those of equal citizenship or multiculturalism, which are especially prominent in settings that are visible to international audiences. And of course, there are different discourses addressed to different domestic audiences, since domestic audiences are segmented as well. So, for example, President Nazarbayev's discourse aimed at the Russophone residents of Kazakhstan is much more civic and multiculturalist than his discourse aimed at Kazakh speakers. Plus, nationalizing discourse is itself far from monolithic. And this is evident as soon as one looks more closely at the elements of the general model that I've sketched. So consider the idea that the state is properly understood as the state of and for a particular ethnocultural nation. Well, this can mean that the state is understood to belong in some sense to a distinct and clearly bounded ethno-national collectivity, right? So a sense, for example, that Kazakhstan is in the first instance the state of and for Kazakhs as a bounded collectivity, but it can also mean that primacy is accorded not to a distinct and bounded ethno-national collectivity, but rather to a distinct culture. So Ukraine, for example, can be understood not so much as the state of and for a bounded collectivity, but rather as a state with perhaps a distinctive mission or task, namely protecting and promoting Ukrainian language and culture. So you might call these two variants of nationalizing discourse ethnicist and culturalist variants of nationalizing discourse. These variants are related And I think if you push the culturalist discourse far enough, you may end up with something like an ethnicist premise, in the sense that cultural patterns are seldom understood as free-floating. They are rather understood as belonging to, or at least as characteristic of, a particular group. So to privilege, let's say, a distinctive language could be understood as ultimately privileging the ethnocultural group whose language it is. But still, there are significant differences of emphasis and inflection in nationalizing discourse, both between and within successor states. Nationalizing discourse can be more assimilationist or more differentialist. For example, the assimilationist variant seeks to nationalize the population, to remake the human material of the state, to alter identities and group boundaries. While on the other hand, the differentialist variant seeks to redistribute power, positions, and prestige among groups without altering group boundaries or identities. And there are other ways in which nationalizing discourse can differ in both within and between successor states. The core nation, for example, may be seen as more or less sharply bounded, more or less joinable. There may be a strong sense of ethno-national ownership of the state, or a less exclusive claim to some form of primacy. Or the weakness of the core nation can be understood primarily in ethno-demographic terms, or rather more in cultural terms. Or the proposed remedial action may be oriented, on the one hand, to strengthening the demographic preponderance or economic welfare or political hegemony of the core nation as a bounded collectivity, or it may be devoted, that is, the remedial action may be devoted to strengthening the national language and culture. So these are some examples of the various ways in which nationalizing discourse differs, and any sustained, careful study of nationalizing discourse in the Soviet, post-Soviet space would have to be sensitive to these kinds of differences. But now I want to broaden the discussion to go beyond just talking about discourse. I'd like to talk about nationalizing policies and practices and processes, as well as discourses. And I want to consider 5 domains in which we can see nationalizing processes, policies, practices, as well as discourses at work. And these domains are ethno-political demography, first; secondly, language; thirdly, the economy; fourthly, the polity; and lastly, symbols and narratives, though I'm going to have time to discuss only the first 2 in any detail. And this is, of course, not a complete list, but concentrating on particular domains rather than in general talking about nationalizing discourses or policies or processes. I think concentrating on particular domains makes it easier to sharpen our ideas and pose questions in a more focused manner. So the first domain that I want to talk about is what I'm going to call ethno-political demography. What do I mean by this? I mean discourse, policies, and processes that have to do with the absolute or relative demographic strength or weakness of the core nation. Now, all standard demographic variables, especially things like fertility and migration, can become the focus of ethnopolitical concern and ethnopolitical claims making, not only in the post-Soviet context, but in many other settings. But what I want to focus on here is not, let's say, the politics of fertility or the politics of migration, which you might call first-order questions of ethnopolitical demography. But rather, I want to focus on the politics of counting and categorizing, which you could call second-order questions. Second order in the sense that they concern how these first-order ethnodemographic processes are represented in the public sphere. Counting and categorizing by nationality were central to the Soviet system of institutionalized multinationality, and they remain central in the successor states. Most identity cards no longer include an entry for nationality, but all post-Soviet censuses continue to ask about nationality, and nationality continues to be recorded in social surveys and many bureaucratic transactions, which means that we get statistics that are produced and classified by nationality on such matters as births, marriages, school attendance, and citizenship status, among others. The basic premise of nationalizing discourses and policies, namely the weakness of the core nation, the illegitimate and unfair weakness of the core nation, that premise is supported and documented with the help of statistics on nationality and language. So titular weakness is both documented in the present and narrated and explained historically by means of this kind of statistics. And indeed, historically, the seriously weak condition of the core nation is explained by a narrative of Soviet-engineered ethnographic and ethno-linguistic decline, a narrative that gains its evidence and authority, ironically, precisely through official Soviet statistics on nationality and language. And then, of course, counting and categorizing by nationality and language are also central to the monitoring of remedial nationalizing policies and practices. So data from the first round of post-Soviet censuses carried out between 1999 and 2001 were particularly important in this connection. And as you know, we're only beginning to get the data from the second round of post-Soviet censuses. Only in Kazakhstan and Latvia are preliminary results from the second round available among the countries I'm considering, with censuses being carried out this year in Estonia and Ukraine. Now, everywhere, the census, of course, has documented a nationalizing ethno-demographic trend, with the titular share of the population increasing sharply and the Russian and Russophone share declining sharply. The trend, of course, was no surprise, but the changes were perhaps larger than anticipated. And the census results then publicly ratified the nationalizing trend. They strengthened the understanding and representation of the successor states as the states of and for particular nations. So you could say that in this sense, the census did not only document a trend, but it helped to constitute a new reality, a new social and political reality. Interestingly, despite the very different context, the numbers of those identifying their nationality as Russian declined by about 25% in the first 10 years of independence in all four states that I'm considering. But the titular share of the population increased much more sharply in Kazakhstan than in the other three countries. The Kazakhstani census confirmed that Kazakhs had crossed this crucial political, psychological threshold and comprised already 10 years ago a majority of the population, increasing from just 40% in 1989 to 53% 10 years later, and to 63% in 2009. In the other three countries, the titular share increased by about 5 percentage points in the first post-Soviet census, and in Latvia, as you know, the titular share has continued to increase, rising from 52% in 1989 to 62% last year. The proportionally similar declines in the Russian and Russophone population conceal different stories. So Russian and Russophone outmigration accounts for most of the decline in the Baltics, at least in the first post-Soviet decade, and in Kazakhstan. But in Ukraine, ethno-national re-identification appears to be much more important. That is, many people who previously identified their nationality as Russian, many of them presumably from mixed nationality families, appear to have switched to Ukrainian in the most recent census, and young people from mixed nationality families who are being counted for the first time in censuses seem to have become more likely to identify or to be identified as Ukrainian. Now, in Ukrainian nationalizing discourse, this process of re-identification represents a form of statistical redress through which real Ukrainians rediscover their true identity. But this is an essentialist misunderstanding of the way in which censuses work. Mixed and fluctuating identities are characteristic of borderland populations, and changes in sovereignty have occasioned ethno-national re-identification in many other contexts, as historians have amply demonstrated. Now, progress in nationalization has been charted through statistics on language as well as on nationality, and all 4 countries have reported large increases in knowledge of the titular language by non-titular populations. Even in Kazakhstan, where only 15% of Russians claimed to know the state language, this was up from less than 1% in 1989. And another 27% of Russians reported that they were learning Kazakh. In the other 3 countries, roughly half of Russians claimed knowledge of the state language in the first post-Soviet census, 2 to 3 times more than a decade earlier. This process has continued. Now, the analytical point I want to emphasize is that statistics on nationality and language do not simply measure the progress of nationalizing states in some objective way. They help produce that progress. As many have argued in the last 2 decades, the procedures that states use, I'm not just talking about post-Soviet states here, the procedures that any states use to count and identify and categorize their populations do not provide just a neutral and transparent record of social reality. They help constitute that reality. So statistics are a medium through which nationalization can be effected or created, not simply a medium through which it is described. And the issue here is not the fabrication or falsification of data. It's the ways in which choices about counting and categorizing, choices about what to count and how to count it, can shape prevailing representations of state and society. And then those representations can help shape political debate and frame policy options and legitimate particular stances and decisions. Now, in Kazakhstan, for example, the nationalizing demographic trend was not in doubt, but it was uncertain whether the 1999 census would reveal a Kazakh majority, this symbolically resonant threshold. This may have led officials to anticipate demographic sovereignty, as one scholar called it, and to ensure that the census would ratify an official demographic majority. And indeed, it did so. Now, a second issue concerns not just how numbers are computed, but how they are presented, and more fundamentally, how choices about categories shape representations of the population. Because categorization always involves choices, decisions about lumping or splitting, disputes about combining or distinguishing categories have been part of the disputes about modern censuses from the very beginning. And in the post-Soviet context, counting by ethnic nationality tends to represent minorities as smaller and more fragmented than would other ways of counting. So in Kazakhstan, for example, distinctions of nationality among Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Poles have little meaning or relevance for most people. These populations are overwhelmingly Russophone. They're not divided by any significant social boundaries, such as barriers to intermarriage. So in this context, counting by ethnic nationality, that is, presenting statistics on Kazakhs and on individual European nationalities, rather than on Kazakhs and Europeans or Slavs, serves to obscure the persistence of a large Russian-speaking minority. And similar techniques of data presentation have been used in Estonia and Latvia to minimize the size and exaggerate the fragmentation of the overwhelmingly Russophone minority population. Statistics on language have also been computed and presented in ways that understate heterogeneity. So in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, for example, substantial fractions of the titular population still prefer to speak Russian. This linguistic divide among titulars is masked by using statistics on native language, because native language continues to be interpreted, as in Soviet times, as the language of one's ethnic nationality, for the most part, regardless of whether or how well one speaks that language. Thus, while nearly all Kazakhs, 98.5%, named Kazakh as their native language, even in the 1989 census, observers suggested that about 40% of Kazakhs and a higher fraction of urban Kazakhs spoke the language poorly or not at all. Similarly, 85% of ethnic Ukrainians, that is about 2/3 of the population, named Ukrainian as their native language in the 2001 census. But if statistics were gathered and published on language of preference rather than native language, Ukraine would come out as nearly evenly divided between those preferring to speak Russian and those preferring Ukrainian. So these differing ways of presenting data, these differing representations, can be used to justify then very different policies. Okay, now I want to move on to the second domain, and my second domain is language. And of course, I've just been talking about statistics on language in connection with issues of counting and categorizing, but now I want to focus more directly on language processes and policies. In the Soviet successor states, as in the Soviet Union and East Central Europe generally, language is generally understood as constitutive of nationality for collectivities, but an individual person's nationality does not necessarily depend on the language he or she is most comfortable speaking. In the Soviet Union, as you know, official nationality was much stickier than language repertoires and practices. Language repertoires changed massively during the Soviet period, but official nationality did not. Change in language repertoires involved both the acquisition of new languages, especially Russian, and in some cases the loss of competence in national languages, which led then to large-scale discrepancies between language practices and official nationality. Members of various national groups increasingly spoke Russian in a wide variety of contexts and domains, and in some cases were unable to speak what was supposedly their own language at all. And this, of course, then set the stage for one important strand of nationalizing politics, for the effort to restore the congruence between nationality and language that nationalists saw as having been destroyed by decades of Russification. Now, this was relatively straightforward here in Latvia and in Estonia, where there had, after all, been little erosion in the titular population's command over the titular language. There was no need to change titulars' language repertoires or preferences. Policies sought simply to make it possible for titulars to use the titular language in the full range of domains and contexts and throughout the territory of the state. And this, of course, was done by mandating the use of the titular language in various domains, by using language tests to exclude Russian monolinguals from positions involving contact with the public. But the issue was much more complicated in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, where substantial segments of the titular population could not speak or write the titular language, or simply preferred to speak Russian. It was easy enough for Russophone Ukrainians to learn Ukrainian, and it was easy enough, as in the Baltics, to expand by decree the domains in which Ukrainian was supposed to be used, and certainly the prestige of Ukrainian has increased, yet a substantial fraction of self-identified ethnic Ukrainians continue to use Russian or a mix of Russian and Ukrainian in private. And restoring the congruence between language and nationality has been equally difficult in Kazakhstan. The prestige of Kazakh, like the prestige of Ukrainian, has increased, and most Kazakhs have acquired at least a minimal competence in the language, but for many urban Kazakhs, this competence remains limited, and the use of Kazakh is largely symbolic. Now, what about then policies aimed at getting the non-titular population to learn the titular language? Such policies are often characterized and often criticized as assimilationist, but in fact, there's surprisingly little talk of assimilation. I think this is partly because assimilationist talk runs counter to prevailing international norms supporting multiculturalism and the preservation of minority languages and cultural identities. But it also runs counter to the legacy of Soviet nationality policy with its quasi-primordialist understanding of ethnic nationality. And also, I think there's considerable ambivalence about assimilation, especially here and in Estonia, where language is widely understood as a key ethnic boundary marker, even by some as the distinctive property of a particular ethno-national group. And in Kazakhstan, where the difference between Europeans and Central Asians is widely understood in more primordial, or one might say ethno-racial terms, assimilation is widely seen as inconceivable. So if language policies don't aim at assimilation, what do they aim at? Well, particularly in the Baltics and Ukraine, they aim in the first instance to redistribute the burden of bilingualism. So again, as you all know very well, in the late Soviet era, Russophones could live and work as monolinguals throughout the territory of the state, while others were expected to be bilingual, even in their own republics. Nationalizing language policies in the successor states have required Russophones to become bilingual in the titular language, and this has then made it easier for titulars to speak the titular language in a wider domain, wider range of domains and context, instead of being obliged to speak Russian when interacting with Russian monolinguals. Of course, this may still happen, that is, titulars may still speak Russian in various contexts, and I gather this happens not only in Ukraine but in Latvia, but nonetheless these policies have freed titulars to learn other foreign languages than Russian, notably English, although there does remain considerable interest in learning Russian throughout the post-Soviet space, even, if I understand correctly, in here and in Estonia. Now, I've been talking about the aims of nationalizing language policies. I'd like now to say a few words about the instruments of these policies, and three in particular: prescriptive rules or mandates first, secondly, language tests, and thirdly, policies governing the language of instruction in the school system. In each of the four countries that I'm talking about, prescriptive rules mandate the use of the titular language in certain contexts, like government and administration, or the courts, or media, or public signage, or in some workplaces, in parts of the educational system. And these kinds of rules have been justified by the fact that the titular language is formally the sole state language. They've also been justified by the assumption that it's the majority languages that require protection and promotion by the state, not, as in most other contexts, the minority languages. And this, I think, is in keeping with the remedial character of nationalizing policies and with the emphasis on redress, and it's part of what makes the post-Soviet context distinctive. Now, the second instrument is the use of language tests to regulate access to certain positions and statuses. And most importantly, of course, this has involved access to the status of citizenship in Estonia and Latvia. And even today, a third of the Russophone population in Latvia, and I think a somewhat larger fraction, nearly half of the Russophone population in Estonia, remains without Latvian or Estonian citizenship. Language tests were also introduced in Estonia and Latvia, of course, for a wide range of jobs, not only in the state sector, but in other contexts as well, insofar as positions involve contact with the public. And this was in keeping with the aim mentioned above of making it possible for titulars to conduct their everyday business in the titular language. In Kazakhstan, nationalist intellectuals called for language tests on many occasions, but no such tests have in fact been adopted. Why? Partly because such tests would be highly divisive among Kazakhs themselves. So it's also the case that language tests have not been instituted in the Ukraine either, although there's legislation that officials must learn Ukrainian. Now, the third instrument of linguistic nationalization, and I think in the long run probably the most important instrument or tool, is the school system. Since the late 19th century, when states first began to provide universal and compulsory primary education, schools have served as the primary instrument of nationalization in a wide range of cases. Again, way beyond the post-Soviet and Soviet sphere. But schools can also work in a very different direction. That is, when you have primary, secondary, and even university education widely available in a minority language, then schools can serve as the key institutional mechanism for the reproduction of minority communities and languages. And this, of course, was the situation in the Soviet Union. Not only in the 1920s, in the era of colonization, when the regime made vast and unprecedented efforts to promote minority languages and cultures, but even, though in a more attenuated form, during the final decades of its existence. And this Soviet pattern of state-provided education in minority languages has been carried over into the successor states. So we have state-run schools with Russian as the medium of education in all of the countries I'm considering, though policies toward those schools have varied. So here and in Estonia, where Russian medium schools are used only by Russophone minorities, exclusively Russian medium education is being phased out at the high school level. As you know, the current policy in both countries calls for at least 60% of the high school curriculum to be taught in the titular language, though whether this is actually being done and how well it is being done are, of course, open to debate. The rationale, as you know, for this policy is that it should help improve the labor market integration of graduates of Russian medium schools. But in Kazakhstan, nationalization of education has been aimed in the first instance not at Russophone minorities, but rather at heavily Russified urban Kazakhs. And while only about half of urban Kazakhs were in Kazakh medium classes in 1990, the share increased quickly to nearly 3/4 about 5 years later, but since then there hasn't been that much change, and a substantial share of urban Kazakhs continue to be educated in Russian medium classes. And these figures, in any event, overstate the degree of nationalization, since 40% of the urban students in Kazakh medium classes are, in fact, attending mixed schools. That is, they're in Kazakh medium classes, but in mixed schools where the linguistic environment outside the classroom remains largely Russophone. And part of the increase also reflects the heavy internal migration of non-Russified Kazakhs from the countryside, rather than a shift in language strategies on the part of a largely Russified elite. So the urban Kazakh elite remains heavily invested in Russian as a language of mobility and opportunity. In Ukraine, too, the shift to titular medium education was aimed in the first place at titulars, and specifically at the 25% of ethnic Ukrainian children who were being educated in Russian medium schools in 1989. So here, too, the aim of nationalists was to reverse decades of Russification and to restore what they understood to be the proper congruence between nationality and language, including the language of education. So in the early 1990s, the government strongly encouraged the shift to Ukrainian medium education, and there was a substantial increase in the share of institutions teaching in Ukrainian from about half in 1996 to nearly 3/4 in 2002. But this increase has been extremely uneven across regions. So while education is now almost exclusively in Ukrainian in the West, and while Kiev witnessed a massive and rapid switch to Ukrainian, Russian medium education remains predominant in the East and South. Okay, so much for the aims and instruments of linguistic nationalization. What about the results of nationalizing policies and practices? And here again we encounter problems of counting and categorizing. There are statistics which represent linguistic nationalization as an unambiguous success. These statistics document an increase in the share of those declaring the titular language their native language. They show an increase in the share of non-titulars who know the titular language. They show an increase in titular medium schooling. But other statistics suggest a different picture. So again, it's useful to think of Ukraine, where the blurring of both ethnic and linguistic categories and boundaries makes issues of counting and categorizing by language and nationality especially complex. And I've already mentioned, with reference to Ukraine, that differing ways of counting yield sharply discrepant pictures of the overall linguistic landscape in Ukraine. The official portrait of a steady and successful Ukrainization or de-Russification of education has been challenged as well. Some schools are classified as Ukrainian, for example, even if only a few subjects are taught in Ukrainian. There was a survey in Kiev where formally a massive shift to Ukrainian medium education has taken place. This survey showed that only a fifth of school children spoke Ukrainian at school outside the classroom. And the print media remain Russian-dominated, while radio and television broadcast in both languages, often on the same channel. And the overall picture that sociolinguists suggest is that outside of Western Ukraine, Ukrainian often functions as a kind of government-supported artificial language of education and administration, which is unable to compete on its own with Russian. And even in Latvia, some sociolinguists have noted that some Latvian speakers continue to address Russian speakers in Russian, even when the Russian speakers can also speak Latvian. But the analytical point that I want to make here is that there are important limits to nationalizing policies in the sphere of language. What can the state do? The state can mandate that the titular language be used in certain settings, but those mandates may or may not be enforced. Language tests can be used. They can create incentives for titulars and minorities to develop a certain competence in the titular language, but they can't guarantee that the language will be used in everyday practice. So the state can't legislate changes in linguistic preferences, nor can a liberal state do much to legislate changes in language practices, especially in the private sphere. So language shift, changes in linguistic repertoires and practices, this is a very complex process, and it's not something that can be simply decreed from on high. Now, a fuller analysis would examine at least three other domains: the economic domain, the political sphere, and the sphere of symbols and narratives. I'm not going to discuss these in any detail, but I want to say a few words about each. In the economic domain, the basic question is whether, and if so, how, discourses, policies, and practices have promoted the economic interests of the core nation. Now, if you look back at interwar East Central Europe and Eastern Europe, discourses and policies promoting economic nationalization, which were strongly nourished by anti-Semitism, were very prominent. Nationalizing elites during the interwar period sought to conquer what they characterized as the ethno-nationally alien urban economy. Now, by comparison, there are no comparably explicit discourses or policies in Soviet successor states. Language tests, yes, have excluded monolingual Russophones from the public sector in Estonia and Latvia, but the net effects of a restrictive citizenship policy and language tests appear to be surprisingly small once you control for other factors. If one focuses on informal practices rather than on formal policies or explicit discourses, then you can certainly see evidence of economic nationalization in Kazakhstan, as Kazakhs have come to displace Russians quite massively in many key positions. Yet, while this result can be described as a kind of nationalization, the mechanisms that produce this result are not necessarily well captured by the notion of nationalization. And this is because the networks that govern access to desirable positions and resources in Kazakhstan are structured along lineage or clan or patron-client lines rather than along ethno-national lines per se. So what appears on the surface as a kind of nationalization or Kazakhization is in fact a more complex process that involves a whole lot of intra-Kazakh competition. Okay, what about the political domain? Here, three issues are especially salient. The first, which has been central here and in Estonia, is the nationalization of the demos through restrictive citizenship policies. And even today, as I noted above, and as you're well familiar with, a third to a half of the Russophone population in both countries remains without Estonian or Latvian citizenship. The second key issue, which has been particularly important in Kazakhstan, is the nationalization of government and administrative personnel through informal recruitment and promotion practices. And the third issue, which has been particularly important in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, is the vexed question of federalism or regional autonomy, as well as other questions about the boundaries and competencies of territorial administrative units. The final domain of nationalization of the five that I've mentioned here is that of symbols and narratives. And here the key question is how state and nation and the relation between state and nation are publicly represented. The practices and politics of representation have been studied in a rich variety of sites in recent years. These include things like the iconography of symbols of state and nation in such media as flags, emblems, passports, currency, monuments, and public architecture. The symbolism of street and place names, plaques, and other inscriptions is another site that's been widely studied, as is the language of constitutional preambles or national anthems. There's also the narratives of state and nation conveyed in history and civics textbooks, as well as the organization of holidays and festivals. And scholars have finally studied also the framing and presentation of museum exhibits. So in all of these domains, in studying the public representations of state and nation, one can ask three kinds of questions. One type of question focuses on the content of representations and asks to what degree such representations portray the state as the state of and for an ethnoculturally defined core nation, or rather portray the state as the state of and for all of its citizens. A second type of question concerns political struggles over representations in these various settings. These include struggles between those claiming to represent the titular population and those claiming to represent minority populations, but not only those. They also include struggles between differently positioned titular elites over how state and nation should be represented in these symbolic domains. And lastly, one can focus on the reception of representations. One can ask, how do representations matter? Do they matter at all? Do they affect subjectivities and self-understandings? Do such symbolic representations of state and nation help to constitute a new common sense, a new set of taken for granted assumptions? Now, this reception question is, of course, more difficult to study than it is to study the content and the overt politics of representation, but it raises equally important questions. So now, having identified a few key domains of analysis and dimensions of variation, I want to make a few brief summary comparative observations. In Kazakhstan, the boundary between core nation and Slavic minorities is sharp and socially significant. Nationalizing discourse, policies, and practices vis-a-vis Slavic minorities have been differentialist, not assimilationist. That is, they have not sought to turn Russians or Russophones into Kazakhs, but rather to promote the demographic robustness, the economic strength, and the political hegemony of Kazakhs as a bounded ethno-national collectivity. Cultural nationalization in Kazakhstan, however, has taken a different course. The promotion of Kazakh language has targeted Russified urban Kazakhs, not Slavic minorities. And despite increased competence in and use of the Kazakh language, Russian remains strongly entrenched among urban Kazakhs as a language of opportunity, a language of mobility, a language of prestige. In Ukraine, the linguistic and social boundaries between core nation and the large Russian minority are blurred and permeable. Ethno-demographic nationalization, that is what you see reflected in census results, has resulted from individuals reclassifying themselves across this blurred boundary. It has not resulted from sharp ethnic differences in fertility or migration patterns, as it has in Kazakhstan. Linguistic nationalization in Ukraine, as in Kazakhstan, has been slowed by the continued strength of Russian among titulars in the eastern part of the country. But in the West, the Ukrainian language is solidly entrenched, and the linguistic proximity between Russian and Ukrainian, of course, has made it relatively easy for Russian speakers in that region to assimilate linguistically. So the result is a core nation that is easily joinable, and yet territorially and linguistically deeply divided. The politics of nationalization in Ukraine, of course, has a strong regional dimension and is strongly intertwined, therefore, with geopolitical and geoeconomic questions concerning the relations of Ukraine with Russia on the one hand and the EU on the other. In Estonia and Latvia, the linguistic and social boundaries between the core nation and the large Russian-speaking minorities have been sharp, though perhaps, at least initially, sharper probably in Estonia than in Latvia. Restrictive citizenship policies, strongly nationalizing language legislation, and an often sharply anti-Russian nationalizing discourse led many Russian speakers to leave both countries early on, and many Russian speakers remain non-citizens nearly 20 years later. The burdens of bilingualism have been redistributed. Russophones have been obliged to learn the titular language, while titulars need no longer speak or learn Russian. And nationalizing educational policies are beginning to phase out Russian medium secondary schools, which may, in the longer run, erode the key institutional basis for the reproduction of a distinctive Russian-speaking minority. But because language is understood as constitutive of nationhood, the nation is joinable in time, in Benedict Anderson's evocative expression. So in the longer run, the boundary, the social boundary between titulars and Russians is likely to weaken substantially in Estonia and Latvia. So you have three different sorts of ethno-national boundaries. Of course, this is a very oversimplified picture. A strong and stable boundary between core nation and Russian-speaking minorities in Kazakhstan, a blurred and permeable boundary in Ukraine, and a strong but intergenerationally permeable boundary in the Baltic countries. Nationalization has involved a clear shift in demographic, economic, and political position and power between titular and Russophone minority populations in both Kazakhstan and the Baltics, but not in Ukraine, where the boundary between titular and minority populations is blurred, and where the politics of nationalization has been articulated along regional and linguistic rather than ethno-national lines. Linguistic nationalization has been focused on altering the language repertoires and practices of titulars in Kazakhstan. It's been focused on altering the language repertoires and practices of Russophone minorities in the Baltic states, and it's been focused on both titulars and Russophone minorities in Ukraine. The Russian language remains in a particularly strong position in Kazakhstan and Ukraine, indicating the limits of state-promoted language change. But in the Baltics, linguistic nationalization has been more successful. Russian quickly lost its position as the default language of interethnic interaction, and there's a good chance of an intergenerational language shift over the long term. Again, it could take 2 generations or more among the remaining Russophone population. I want to return in conclusion to the question I posed at the outset. Does the concept of nationalizing states offer a useful conceptual prism through which to examine state building, the politics of nationhood, and the dynamics of ethno-national boundaries in Soviet successor states? My answer to this question is a qualified yes. I do think the notion of nationalizing states directs our attention to a rich and interesting nexus of discursive claims, symbolic representations, formal policies, informal practices, and social processes. And I think it can help us formulate analytically interesting comparative questions about these claims, about these representations, about these policies and practices and processes. But there are limitations to this analytical prism, and I'd like to note some of these in conclusion. First of all, the concept of nationalizing states is not a theory. It does not enable one to predict how nationalizing states will be or how they will be nationalizing. Secondly, the concept of nationalizing states is not a device for classifying states as nationalizing or non-nationalizing, or for ranking states as more or less nationalizing, or still less for assessing the legitimacy of their policies and practices. It's not a normative device. It's not a device for posing yes or no questions like, is Ukraine a nationalizing state? Or is Latvia more or less nationalizing than Estonia? Thirdly, the term nationalizing state is potentially misleading insofar as it can be taken to apply to the state as a whole, rather than to an assemblage, and not necessarily a coherent assemblage, of discourses, policies, practices, and processes. So strictly speaking, it makes more sense to speak of nationalizing discourses and of nationalizing policies, of nationalizing practices, or nationalizing processes than it does to speak of a nationalizing state as a whole. That said, I do like the dynamic and processual implications of the term, and I like the ambiguity inherent in the word state, which suggests both the state as a concrete organizational structure and a state as an abstract condition. But it's important to emphasize that the term nationalizing state is at best a shorthand device pointing to an array of discourses, policies, practices, and processes, not pointing to a single thing. The conceptual model of the nationalizing state was intended to serve as a tool for posing questions about discourses, policies, practices, and processes, and about the relation between them. It was not intended to provide an a priori answer to such questions. So the notion of nationalizing state stands not at the end of analysis, but at the beginning. It's not a conclusion that one arrives at after examining the evidence. It's just a way of posing questions and organizing empirical analysis. Now, the fourth and most important limitation is that using the notion of nationalizing state as an analytical prism or framework risks obscuring other analytical perspectives, and in particular it risks contributing to what I've called in other writings an over-ethnicized understanding of the social world. Processes of state consolidation, for example, are at best imperfectly described and maybe misleadingly described if one focuses on nationalizing discourses, or policies, or practices. And this holds also for processes of cultural transformation, even more so for processes of economic transformation. Both nationalizing discourse and what you might call counter-nationalizing discourse can mask or obscure as much as they reveal. Such discourses can be deployed strategically. They may even be deployed cynically by incumbents or contenders for political power. These discourses may mask the pursuit of clan, clique, or class interests. So the analytical prism of the nationalizing states is not, as it were, a self-sufficient theoretical perspective. It needs to be used in connection with other political, economic, social, structural, and cultural modes of analysis if we're going to succeed in specifying the material and symbolic interests that are at stake, or the forms of social closure and exclusion that are in operation, or the patterns of state consolidation or economic transformation or cultural reorganization that have been occurring in the post-Soviet space. So focusing on nationalizing discourses, policies, practices, and processes is one way of capturing certain social, cultural, and political dynamics in Soviet successor states. And as I suggested at the outset, the dual Soviet legacy of institutionalized multinationality on the one hand, and linguistic and demographic Russification on the other hand, helps explain the pervasiveness of nationalizing discourse and the attractiveness to a good part of the electorate of nationalizing policies in the successor states. But this pervasiveness, this attractiveness, is by no means uniform within or between states, nor is it uniform over time. Nationalizing discourse is intertwined with other discourses. Nationalizing policies are intertwined with other policies. Nationalizing processes are intertwined with other processes. So the notion of nationalizing state is certainly not any kind of master concept that is supposed to capture the essence of post-Soviet political, cultural, and social life. It's just one conceptual tool, one conceptual model, if you like, among many others that may help us pose some analytically interesting comparative questions. And I hope that these questions could be extended to other contexts as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for lecture. And now I would like to introduce our co-referee, Ines Šūpule. Actually, she will continue the question of this reception question and will focus on issues of, resistance to nationalizing discourse in Latvia.
Thank you. Dear Professor Brubaker, dear audience, First, I would like to say that I'm very grateful and honored to be here and have a possibility to listen, talk, and discuss with Professor Rodžera Brubeikera. The focus of our discussion today is on Brubaker's article, Nationalizing States Revisited. Therefore, I will concentrate my attention particularly on the ideas in this article. With my experience in analysis of survey data and ethnic discourses in Latvia, I fully agree with a lot of conclusions made by Professor Brubaker, including when nationalizing discourse characteristics. I'm even very surprised how precisely they have been written. I fully agree with the argumentation and conclusions on the counting and categorizing practices of states, that they do not provide a neutral and transparent record of social reality, but help constitute that reality. Quite a good example here is that according to current categorizing practices, there are no Russian schools in Latvia. They have been called schools implementing minority programs. Although less than 1% among all schools use other language of instruction than Latvian or Russian, namely almost all minority schools are Russian language schools, with some exceptions like one Ukrainian schools and some Polish schools. This is just a very good example of categorizing practices. But now I would like to turn to the topic I announced as my main theme, and that is resistance to nationalizing discourses in Latvia, and namely about the resistance among Russian minority. This is a topic which was not touched by Professor Brubaker, but seems very important to me in this context. First of all, I would like to stress that in respect of ethno-political questions, there are two very strong opposite discursive positions in Latvia, which I and my colleagues have used to call discourse of Latvian ethno-nationalism, which constructs ethnic Latvians to be victims of the Soviet regime, and the Russian language and right defense repertoire, which construct Russians as discriminated in Latvia. The contradictions of these discursive positions can be extrapolated and time to time attributed to all society, and we can talk about this discursive conflict in Latvia. This is perfectly illustrated by two collections of signatures for referenda in 2011 on public education only in Latvian, and second on Russian as a second state language. As I see here in audience international students, I will remind to others and inform international students. But the first signature collection was initiated by the National Association All for Latvia and for Fatherland and Freedom, which has won 14 deputy seats in last parliamentary elections. And the signature collection was aimed to make Latvian language as the only language of instruction in public schools. The second signature collection, which ended with referenda, was initiated by the non-governmental organization Mother Tongue and their leaders Vladimir Linderman and Evgeny Osipov. It was aimed to achieve the status of the Russian language as a second state language. Both radical positions and activities of these radical groups involved all society in the referendum and ethnic discussions in 2011 and at the beginning of 2012. This is just a very good example how discursive practices are connected with discourses, and practices are totally connected. The turnout of referendum on the Russian language as a second state language was 71%, and the 25% of voters said they were in favor, but 75% voters said they were against Russian as a second state language. The results of referendum strongly confirm that an ethnic vote was dominated in this referendum, because especially the indicative are results in Riga, Daugavpils and Latgale region. I will not stay here in details, but this case is really indicative for these two discourses and corresponding practices. and the importance of them in Latvia. If you talk about the resisting practices, I would like to stress that one of them is also immigration of Russians. And another protest actions and this development of alternative discourse, I call this Russian language and rights defense repertoire. As illustrated with referenda initiatives, the strengthening of the Russian language and rights defense repertoire is a tool for manipulations of political leaders in the Russian-speaking population that want monopoly representation of their group. And of course, there are political leaders which want monopoly representation in Latvian-speaking language group as well. Finally, if you talk about the reactions among Russian minority in Latvia to nationalizing discourses and practices, of course we can see also some trends of assimilation and integration. The most vivid data in this respect comes from the statistics of school system. Due to immigration, demographic tendencies, and also assimilation, number of pupils learning in Russian has declined from 39% in 95-96 to 26% in 2010-2011. Summing it up about these different reactions among Russian minority, we can see that here very helpful can be a typology of Albert Hirschman, and we can adopt his strategies, exit, voice, and loyalty, like exit is immigration, voice, that is this active arguing alternative discourses and practices, I illustrated previously, and protest actions as well, and loyalty might be these assimilation and integration tendencies. This is about these resisting practices here in Latvia. Finally, I would like to say some words about this concept of nationalizing states. I think this concept is very useful in the context of comparative analysis of post-Soviet states as it is used in this particular article. But to my mind, it would be less useful for deeper analysis of every particular state, as there are very complex processes involved, and this concept does not help explain the role of different agents in these processes. Thank you for your attention, and this is a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Inese. And now I would like to give floor to Ivars Ieps, a political scientist, and the questions will be later.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to have Professor Brubaker here. I have been following his work for at least some time, and not because I have been enjoying it very much, not just because it's relevant for my own research, but also because it's very full of historical and intellectual context, which is also not very common for many students of ethnicity. But as for this particular paper, I would like to raise 4 points and ask one question. And first, I will be referring also to some other work of Professor Brubaker. What I miss in this paper is a famous triadic relationship, which is kind of one of your conceptual trademarks, which involves a very particular relation in this region with 3 fields, namely nationalizing state, the minority in what you call kin state or external national homeland. I think in this particular context, if we are talking about the 4 cases, the Baltics, Kazakhstan and Ukraine, I think that this issue should also be mentioned, and it would be interesting to hear your opinion, what it looks like for you today. When you were writing that book on nationalism reframe, one of your ideas was that basically by this concept of, let's say, compatriots, Russian compatriots, and Россияне or sootечественники, Russia in many cases is trying to exert certain kind of hegemony over this region, which has been lost in territorial terms, but with this kind of kin state care for the minorities, this hegemony is still sustained. And from this point of view, I would say that it would be interesting just to hear your opinion, what it looks like now. The second point concerns your historical thesis, which is, in my opinion, very interesting, concerning the significance of the Soviet nationalities policy, which basically boils down, to my opinion, to this mismatch between the personal principle of the ascribed nationality and the territorial principle of ethno-federal republics. This, in my opinion, is really important also for those who are doing research on Latvian nationalities issues, because we sometimes tend to think that Soviet Union was a kind of assimilationist empire or an anti-national empire, which was clearly not the case. And on the other hand, of course, let's say we can still see these issues that also nowadays, when many of these post-Soviet ethnic conflicts or tensions which are involving minorities fit rather well in this framework, let's say this a newly established nationalizing state insists on its territorial right on the one hand to nationalize the territory and to deprive minorities of what is perceived as privileges. On the other hand, minorities insist on their non-territorial, ethno-cultural rights to use their own language, religion, and so on and so forth, which is clearly the case here in Latvia if we are talking about this Russian-speaking or Russian minority, and so on and so forth. But my point is also concerning the historical legacy of nationalizing here in Latvia. Let's say the Soviet legacy is not the first thing that comes into mind when we are talking about the historical dimension of that. It is rather this interwar period, especially this late interwar period of the Ulmanist dictatorship, which was clearly nationalizing in many ways. Apparently, one has to separate between, let's say, institutional and cultural legacies here. I think the Soviet legacy might be an institutional legacy with this Piataya Grafa and an ethno-federal republic of Latvian SSR, and let's say the cultural dimension of nationalization is much more connected to this interwar period, where we also had a certain type of a nationalizing state here. This issue is still, one could also, let's say, pose questions about, let's say, how this post-Soviet legacy is interacting with the EU nationalities policy concerning quotas and things like that. This is one of the interesting things I just mentioned reading your article. My third point concerns this distinction, which is, in my opinion, is rather useful between differentialist and assimilationist approaches to nationalizing, which is kind of natural. Either you try to improve the position of the so-called titulars and do not care much about the non-titulars, or you want to assimilate the non-titulars. I think this distinction is really important. However, of course, in most cases, these approaches are mixed. For example, in people, let's say, here in Latvia, but also in other states, people are actually presented the choice. You either assimilate or emigrate, which is emigration is clearly a differentialist approach. Assimilation is on the contrary, it's different. you have been writing a lot about those interwar Poland, which is, in my opinion, also an important examples. In my opinion, from that case, you could also, let's say, make a conclusion that it depends very much on which type of minority is that. In Polish case, it was these Ukrainians and White Russians that have to be assimilated, but Jews and Germans which cannot be or shouldn't be assimilated. I think that, and this has partly to do something with my own research. I think that you could find a correlation between the choice of these nationalization strategies and the perceived origins of the minority. These kind of post-imperial minorities that are perceived as historical adversaries of a nation are seldom assimilated. This was also the case in the interwar Latvia, as they tried to assimilate Latgalians, Lithuanians, and Poles, but not the Germans. The best thing Germans could do is to leave. And similar dilemmas also today, let's say, assimilationist and differentialist approaches tend to kind of coexist in many cases. But now I'm coming to more empirical stuff about your empirical conclusions about the results of the nationalizing policies in these 4 countries. I think that your basic assumptions are fully correct, that at least Baltic countries can be seen as moving from this differentialist stance towards more culturalist and assimilationist, which is kind of natural, because initially the task is to protect the ruling position of the titulars, and when this task is kind of accomplished, one can turn also to more kind of culturalist and assimilationist practices. However, there are a few remarks which might, let's say, somehow qualify your position on the Baltics. First, you mention always Latvia and Estonia together, which is probably not always correct, because they are similar, of course, in many respects, but there are also important differences. For example, and that's where political dimension comes into the game. In Estonia, the Russian political elite is to a large extent integrated with the Estonian elite. So there is no strong Russian party in Estonian politics. In the Latvian case, as was mentioned by my colleague, the actually majority of Russians are mobilized by a political force which openly opposes all these nationalization attempts, and as said, it initiated a referendum in February this year on the second state language and so on. So it calls for the extension of voting rights, at least in municipal elections, also to non-citizens. It's much more Russia-friendly than the Latvian parties and so on and so forth. And this is seen basically now, at least it's my perception, by the Latvian nationalizing state. It's seen actually as an incentive to revert to these previous differentialist politics and policies. For example, during the last years, there is this new constitutional doctrine which actually kind of states very manifestly what you said, as a Latvia as a state of and for the ethnic Latvian nation. There is a lot of talk about not granting the citizenship to disloyal people, which kind of presupposes this ethnic division. Ethnic Latvians are permitted to have double citizenship with other EU and NATO member states, which is not the case for many Russian speakers. So, in my opinion, it's in Latvian case we could talk this basic assumption about the differentialist and assimilationist approach is correct, but it's not not going into one direction. It's much more cyclical or circulating or oscillating between these alternatives. So that's not a linear development towards assimilationist and culturalist approaches, which is maybe it's right for Estonia, but not for Latvia. And so my final question will be that you said that at the end of your talk, you said that this concept of a nationalizing state is not supposed to be a normative one. But still, are you sure it's non-normative? Does it have still some kind of normative dimension? It's implying that is it good to be for a state to be a nationalizing state, or isn't it? You have been writing on Max Weber, so is it fully wertfrei, or it still has some normative considerations in it? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think probably you would like to answer to some comments, and then we'll follow questions, okay?
Well, first, just let me say thank you, a very hearty thank you to the two co-referents for their very interesting comments. I appreciate all, both the careful reading of the paper and the very interesting comments made. I want to leave plenty of time for others, so let me just quickly maybe note a few things. I appreciate very much the comments about the very different discursive positions. I appreciate the Hirschman framework, the exit voice loyalty framework, which can indeed be nicely applied here. I'm glad you pointed to the importance about statistics, about the school system, which I think when you look to the future, those kinds of statistics are crucial. That is who, for now, that is, if you want to look at the future, you want to look at who is being educated now in what language, since it's only the presence of separate schools, which after all involve not just learning in a different language, but being socially separate, having different networks of friends and relations and so on. And so there's a lot of, as it were, pregnant in the school system that then turns out later on. So that's a very important place to look. And I think it's still, of course, people are keeping statistics on this, but I think the social processes that lead parents to make choices about school system in the state language or in Russian or in English, for example, those social processes are crucial. Of course, we can point to the obvious issues that, well, in many rural areas, for example, the Russian language schools have been closing and so on. But still, in urban areas, parents have a choice, and not all are sending their children to. Not all children of Russophones are sending their children to Russian language schools. So it's a very interesting set of social processes that, again, are independent of, to a considerable extent, the whole nationalizing discourses, politics, and so on. And I agree completely with your critical observation that the concept of nationalizing state, maybe it's useful in posing questions for comparative research, but it's less useful for deeper analysis of an individual case because it doesn't get down to the level of particular actors, political contingency, and so on, especially when one is talking about four countries. Now, I think it can be. When I initially developed this concept longer ago than I care to remember, I made a point of suggesting that a nationalizing state is not a thing. It's a field of competing positions and stances. And I didn't have the space in this article, nor did I have the knowledge to go into that. But I think if one treats a nationalizing state or a national minority or an external kin state as a field of competing stances, then one can move towards paying greater attention to the competing stances within that field and towards a more differentiated and subtle analysis. But clearly, that was not the case in this paper or the talk. So yes, I appreciate your comments about the triadic framework. Of course, as many people pointed out, and as I of course appreciate one really should speak of at least a quadratic framework and talk about another key external context or external actor, the international organizations, the EU, and so on. And you mentioned that also in your remarks. So yes, I think if ultimately one does want a more dynamic and interactive account of processes that are going on within nationalizing states, and that what was presented in this talk and in this paper was insufficiently interactive, partly because it's a very poor excuse, but journals give you exceedingly few words, and I had to negotiate, I had to fight to get 4,000 more words than ethnic and racial studies usually allows, and so on. So you can't do anything interesting in the length of a journal article these days, and I think it's a ridiculous, totally ridiculous trend, but of course that's just a cop-out. Yes, so one would want to pay attention to dynamism among titular elites and so on. It's not just that there's a titular discourse and as you say, a minority. There's different titular discourses and stances also, and there's struggles, and yes, there's the external kin state. You ask about that. I mean, I think compared to the expectations that some people had, maybe even myself, 20 years ago, I think what one struck by is the relative intermittency and not terribly significant role played by the external kin state. And I think that's, it's not that it's insignificant, but it's just not, it's not really determining, what politics. It may make, of course, Russia makes various discursive pronunciations from time to time, most recently with reference to the referendum here and so on. But on the whole, these are, and maybe this is then maybe it strengthens the pro-Russian elements within the Russian party here and so on. But otherwise, it really is not that. People sort of ignore it. And I found the same thing studying the similar triangular relation, which I've actually spent a whole lot more time and effort studying, namely in the context of Transylvania in Romania, where I wrote I spent a good deal of the last 10 years working on a book on nationalist politics and everyday understandings of ethnicity in one Transylvanian town in which there's a Hungarian minority in the context of a Romanian national and in some ways newly renationalizing state in relation to an external kin state in Hungary. And the kin state, again, is very episodic. Its interventions are largely discursive, and now, actually, more recently, Hungary has taken a much more active stance and with a very strong policy of dual citizenship for people who already have Romanian citizenship and so on. It's been very controversial with the current populist right government in Hungary. That's way beyond anything that the Russian state has done. So I appreciate your comments on the historical background, and I absolutely agree that when we're talking about historical legacies, the legacy of the interwar stateness and statehood and nationalizing states at certain periods of the interwar period is absolutely crucial, of course. And of course, again, I plead few pages and a big subject, but obviously the history of interwar statehood is absolutely fundamental for the Baltic states, and it's in a sense inexcusable not to mention it in this paper. Yes, the difference between differentialist and assimilationist approaches. I guess. Let's see. I agree with your comments that one shouldn't treat, of course, as I do in this paper, largely treating Latvia and Estonia as very similar, but of course you're absolutely right about key differences. First and foremost, as you say, in terms of party structures and political integration, there are other differences as well, though, which are, I think, worth exploring, and especially when we get onto the level of social processes, as I understand, much higher, at least in the beginning of the period of 20 years ago, at least much higher levels of, for example, intermarriage in Latvia than in Estonia. Obviously, you don't have the same kinds of territorial concentration that you have in northeastern Estonia and so on. So there's a whole variety of differences that should be, of course, taken account of, and would be if this were just a paper, let's say. Of course, if you have a paper on Latvia and Estonia, which many scholars have done, of course, then those differences come out. But they didn't come out in this in this discussion. And I guess, certainly agree about the important, look, this is again not a kind of structural model. As a political sociologist, I fundamentally attached great importance to contingent political action. And I think, so in this sense, I would just say it's not only that there's I wouldn't call it just a cyclical oscillation between more assimilationist and more differentialist stance. I would say this is, I agree with your criticism, but I would say it's just, this is a result of contingent political events, and decisions matter, interventions matter. The fact that this nationalist Latvian party proposed the referendum, tried to collect signatures for the referendum, had something to do with the fact then that the Russian party, this is interactive, it's contingent. I mean, you could say that had the Harmony Party been included in the coalition government, then the first attempt to gather signatures might not have happened, and the referendum might not have happened. A lot depends on contingency here. So you're absolutely right to suggest that it's way too simple to say, okay, the stance started off being more differentialist and may move towards being more assimilationist. Okay, if you stand way back at a great distance, maybe that looks approximately right, but it misses so much of what's interesting, and what's interesting does depend on contingent political actions and engagements. So thank you very much for these very, very helpful comments.
Thank you very much for comments to comments. And I'm still happy to have a few questions. And probably you can name for whom you are asking questions and for you to answering just this if necessary.
I'm Toms Rostoks, and I work at the Department of Political Science here, and I teach international politics. Of course, my question goes to Professor Brubaker. Thank you for your talk. That was very interesting, even for someone who's not involved in identity issues on a daily basis. And I hope you don't get a cold after this talk. But my question is more about foreign policy implications of these nationalizing states. Is this something that you have addressed, and is there something that you can comment on, let's say, what implications are there for, Kazakhstan, Estonia, Latvia, Ukraine, as a consequence of these nationalizing state policies? Thank you.
I usually like not to collect, because when you have a lot of questions, you can answer anyway. For one question better and for others. So, yeah, please. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So,
No, it doesn't.
Okay. So foreign policy implications. Well, I'm not a specialist on foreign policy at all, so I don't really know what one can say in general about foreign policy implications. What I would say, though, is that there's a general international embeddedness of the policies and practices of not just these so-called nationalizing states, but any states. And the modes of embeddedness, of course, differ according to the context. And it's been crucial, obviously, for Latvia and Estonia that the years of the early post-Soviet years coincided with a particular mode of international embeddedness and a process of being admitted to various organizations, and which led then to a certain kind of monitoring and kind of quite intensive form, really an unprecedented form of monitoring of developments in Estonia and Latvia about citizenship practices, about language legislation, and so this extremely, a tremendous amount of attention was paid to these small countries by representatives, a High Commissioner of National Minorities and other representatives of European and international organizations. So it's, I don't know if that, so it's an international and interstate embeddedness. Whether that falls in the domain of foreign policy specifically, I don't know, but that's been crucial. And of course, relations with Russia have been crucial, but much more so obviously for Kazakhstan. And Ukraine, as it were, more poised between Russia and the EU and so on. Whereas Russia, even though it's next door to Estonia and Latvia, is because of their early Western embeddedness and so on, it somehow haven't, it's the foreign policy implications the foreign policy connections with Russia haven't been as crucial as they have been, I think, for Ukraine and Kazakhstan with respect to Russia.
So, more questions?
I wanted to ask specifically more about Kazakhstan and about Russians in Kazakhstan and Kazakhs in Kazakhstan, of course. Is there, at least at some level, the growing nationalism between Kazakhs? I mean, you said that the elite is still speaking more Russian language, but is there some waves of at least youngsters who are more willing to speak Kazakh, or at least requiring more curricula in academic life? And then the second question would be to the Russian part. Is there also, do they differentiate them as Kazakh Russians? Because I guess the traditions, they mix quite a lot between, even though the groups are separate, but as you know that traditions as regards to weddings, to funerals, to food, they changed a lot. And the Russians in Kazakhstan, they do these procedures, these traditions in a different way than they would do, for example, as Russians in Moscow. So I just wanted to ask about these interchanges.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate the question. I'm not at all an expert. Well, not only am I not an expert on Kazakhstan, I'm of course not an expert on the post-Soviet space at all. So I'm a kind of interloper here whose empirical work has primarily been elsewhere. But from what I understand from the literature on Kazakhstan, as far as the Kazakhs are concerned, I do think that despite the current strong presence of the Russian language for the Kazakh elite, which will probably continue, despite that, the Kazakh language is indeed in a pretty good position over the longer term. It has to do indeed with the very high birth rates in Kazakhstan. There's huge younger populations. A lot of these younger populations are moving to the cities. These are un-Russified, non-Russified people. There are intra-Kazakh then struggles for access to elite positions. In the long run, the sociolinguistic research that I've seen suggests that Kazakh is probably in a position to become a much more strongly entrenched language, and one that indeed even the elite will have to learn and master much more effectively, which doesn't mean that Russian will be irrelevant, just as it doesn't mean that elites around the world don't speak English in many countries and so on. Of course it will still remain relevant, but the position of Kazakh will be much, much stronger. And the dynamics of the demography of Kazakhstan, is extremely high fertility rates, and the migration rates internally are central to that dynamic. A very interesting question then also about Kazakhstani Russians, although maybe we shouldn't call them Russians, but Russophones or whatever, since really there are lots of nationalities represented. And yes, you're absolutely right that there are major changes when you have multi-generational residents outside the so-called homeland, traditions change and so on. We have examples of this from many other contexts throughout the world, such that when the, say, Kazakhstani Russians or Russophones go back, if they are going back to Russia, as many have, right? I mean, a huge, of course, slow, not cataclysmic, but an enormous migration of out of Kazakhstan on the part of Kazakhstani Russians and Russophones. When they go back to Russia, then I would expect indeed that they are marked and seen and treated as different, just the same way that the German Spätaussiedler, who came so-called back to Germany from Kazakhstan or elsewhere in the Soviet Union or elsewhere in East Central Europe, were treated as different in Germany when they arrived. And just as, for example, the Japanese who went to Brazil and lived for a generation or two, when they come back again to Japan, they have different, they dance differently, they have different rhythms, their bodies are different, and so on. And they are treated then as strangers. So you have this interesting discrepancy in all of these cases between your formal nationality and your embodied way of being, which marks you as different from the people that you're legally and formally supposed to be identical with. Same thing happens in the context I worked in Transylvania. When Transylvanian Hungarians go to Hungary, they again feel different and they're treated as different. They do certain things differently and so on. So this is to be expected. I don't know the literature on no doubt I'm sure there must be really good Russian anthropologists working precisely on the issues of social integration of people coming from Kazakhstan and so on. I don't know that literature, but I would expect that it would treat precisely those themes.
Yeah, one question more.
Hello, my name is Vieslekcija, and I wanted to ask a question, and it will be maybe a little bit more theoretical question. Through your whole talk, you encountered several times 4 concepts: discourses, practices, policies, and processes. And I'm interested in how do you see the difference among these concepts, and is there any difference, for example, between discourse and practice? Should we talk about any differences in the context of nationalizing state between discourse and policy, or discourse and practice? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. It's a very good question. Again, I didn't really make very clear what I meant by any of these terms. And by practices, I guess, practice can mean anything, right? So when I meant kind of nationalizing practices in the way in which people may be, that is, way in which non-titulars may be treated differently, unofficially, right, even if there's not a policy for doing so. But so I guess the main distinction I wanted to draw is just between social processes on the one hand, just that have nothing necessarily to do with politics or high discourse, but just the social processes through which, for example, language is passed on from one generation to another, or choices are made about schools, to take the example I mentioned earlier, or people decide to move, they decide to either emigrate or not emigrate, or to speak one language or another in the household, or to speak one language or another in bilingual settings. And so in these social processes, I guess I wanted to emphasize that they really have a logic and autonomy of their own, and they can't be inferred or predicted from policy. And I guess I've become more interested myself in these social processes in the last 10, 15 years than I have been in the discourse and the policies. So, and I found that in my work in Transylvania, I gave much more attention to the everyday processes involved in being Hungarian or being Romanian in Transylvania, and I saw that as really an autonomous domain that had its own causal dynamics that were really quite separate from the sphere of nationalist talk and nationalist politics and so on. So I think the same thing would be true here, and that's why I'm interested here and in other successes. I'm interested, say, in the work of sociolinguists who study actual language uses in various settings, regardless of what the policies are, regardless of what the laws tell us about what you have to do in the schools. What's actually happening on the ground? And so I guess the main, that's not a very sophisticated theoretical answer, but it just signals my own interest in the everyday on the ground processes, and in studying those, and maybe giving a little bit less attention just to the formal policies and political discourses.
We still have time for one question.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here and a great experience for myself and for us all. And my question is, what is your opinion? Would a conflict emerge among the national ethnic group and the minority in the state if that minority doesn't agree to assimilate that nation's traditions and language also? And well, I'm particularly speaking in example about the situation in Latvia between Russians and Latvians, because it's this minority has grown to such it has such and power and that it begins to oppress the national like traditions and everything.
Well,
Thank you
for the question. I don't see a great likelihood of, I mean, conflict is a word that can mean many things, and life is full of conflict. Life is full of disagreement. Of course, you could say there's conflict in this sense in every Soviet successor state, as there is everywhere in the world. And there's conflict, let's say, in the US about the status of Spanish and so on. I was giving a talk last night about language and religion, and I said there's language conflict everywhere. Is it going to be serious conflict, violent conflict, and so on? I don't think so. The conflict is ubiquitous in social life. And yes, there will be conflict in the future about language in Latvia and Estonia and in Kazakhstan and in Ukraine. Is it likely to be serious conflict that pits the Russians against the Latvians? No, I think that's not the right way to look at it. I don't think there is a group of the Latvians on one side and the Russians on the other side in Latvia or anywhere else. Yes, it's true that the political structure of political parties being different here does create a kind of representation, and there's a substantial party who claims to speak of and for Russians, and sometimes that will generate high emotions, as in connection with this language referendum. But and this was certainly my experience in Transylvania as well. There was very heated political rhetoric in Transylvania between nationalist Hungarians and nationalist Romanians. But was there serious conflict in the town that I studied? No, not. In fact, strikingly not. And my impression is that in the contemporary context, that is in the current geopolitical context, in the context of European integration and so on, I don't see probability of a deep kind of serious conflict. Even in Kazakhstan, where it's much more correct to say in Kazakhstan that the Russophone minorities are simply do not see it as plausible to even learn the language, really, or to assimilate in a deep sense. And so the lines of social division are much sharper. Do I see conflict there? No, not there really either. I see the longer-term process is a slow out-migration. Who knows how far it will go? It's already gone quite far. There's still, of course, a quite substantial Russophone population in Kazakhstan, but the numbers have changed dramatically. And so it's quite striking, actually, I think, how little conflict, a little very deep and serious conflict, compared to what one might have expected. Think of the situation in 1991. It was not only that people talked about the 25 million Russians, that was just Russians, not just Russophones, 25 million Russians in non-Russian successor states. And there was all kinds of talk among policy intellectuals about the tremendous conflict potential of this. I think if this compared to that expectation, there was also, by the way, a lot of expectation there would be massive and massively disruptive outmigration, and it would be chaotic and so on. Again, this hasn't happened, and I don't expect it to happen, actually.
Thank you. And actually, if we still have at least 5 or 3 minutes, and I would like to ask one question myself as well, because at the very beginning of one part of your talk, you mentioned this counting and categorization, how this is used. And Actually, you mentioned this, let's say, Soviet legacy when everyone was counted as belonging to one ethnic group or one national group. But actually, I would say that not only Soviet or post-Soviet states are count its citizens or inhabitants in such way. It's quite widespread, and it is just very recent debates among sociologists and statisticians about more, how to say, honest or open counting to involve all these double loyalties, double nationalities. And I know that these are still discussions in the United States and in some more multinational European states as well. And so my question goes reach beyond the borders of your talk. How you see this counting and categorization at present moment, how it goes on, for example, in the United States. Does it serve some, how to say, honesty to these double nationalities or double belonging?
Yeah, great question. Counting and categorizing is by ethnicity or race or nationality is, as you say, done everywhere in the world, in most, not everywhere, but almost everywhere. And probably there's a trend towards doing more of it rather than less of it over time, as awareness of the marginal status of minorities in certain contexts, or the awareness or concern about discrimination and so on, has led to a greater demand to count people by such categories. But then there's always a tension between the needs of statistics for clarity and unambiguity, for exhaustive and mutually exclusive classification, such that you can be only one thing and not another. That really helps if you're doing statistical analysis. But, as you say, it does violence to people's actual, complex, multiple, fluid identities. And so you see a lot of political struggles about how to count that oscillate between the demands of practicality, as it were, an administrative logic, let's say, of the state, and the lived logic of multiplicity. And this leads to then changes depending on, in very particular settings. So in the US, as this may be motivating your question, in the US, there was, for a long time, campaign to recognize in some way people of mixed racial backgrounds. We had for a long time a one box only. Are you black or white or Native American or Asian and Pacific Islander? And you can only check one of the above. And then there's a separate question for very complicated reasons. Are you Hispanic or Latino or not? Right? But now, in the last two censuses, you've been able to check more than one. Check one or more of these boxes. Now, this is a statistical nightmare, but it maybe is experienced by people as allowing them, as you say, a more true answer. Or we also have a crazy ancestry question in the US Census, which just allows you not just to check one or more boxes, but to write in whatever you want. And now you really think about a statistical nightmare. They have to pay people at the Census Bureau to go through all the thousands of different things that people say and try to kind of consolidate them, recode them, so on, make sense of this. Because of course for ancestry, in an immigration country like the US, a single person may list 7 different nationalities or whatever, and so it's kind of interesting how the Census Bureau processes all this data. But debates like this are going on everywhere. I've been spending the last couple of weeks in Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam, there's a debate going on about moving away from a system of counting immigrants by their ethnic origins and emphasizing more indicators of social class or social integration. In France, the opposite debate is going on. France is one of the few states which, for ideological reasons, has not wanted to count and categorize people by ethnicity or race or religion. This has to do with the idea of a universal republic where everyone is an immediate member and citizen, but sociologists and others are saying, look, there's a reality in French society because of many years of immigration. We have issues of race and racial discrimination and so on. We can't measure how well people are doing unless we count and categorize in this way. So these debates are indeed happening everywhere, and they're taking interestingly different forms in different countries.
Thank you very much for answers. Thank you for paper and co-papers. Thank you for questions and patience to sit and listen all that. Yeah, and so we can close this, at least formally.